I want to welcome you to the Wagner Free Institute of Sciences Weeknights at the Wagner online talk series. I am Susan Glassman, director of the Wagner, and I'm delighted to have you join us for tonight's talk, Sustainable Environmental Adaptation Among the Ancient Maya of Central America by Dr. Stanley Walling. Stan will share his research into how the Maya people have managed a very challenging environment in ways that have been sustainable and supported what seems to have been a very large population. We're really delighted to invite him to join us because sustainability and the environment is a big part of our teaching mission and education. And his work, while it deals with ancient people, resonates so much with the environmental challenges that we face today. So we're really glad to have him here to present his long research and what he's uncovered, which is really very interesting. I know many of you are familiar with the Wagner, but I am going to open with a few words and some program logistics. The Wagner Free Institute of Science is a natural history museum and educational institution that's located in Philadelphia. We were founded in 1855, so we've been around a long time, and we have a dual mission now: to teach contemporary science to the public, but we also interpret and preserve the Wagner's historic building, which is a bit of a time capsule of 19th century science, and I'm sitting in front of an image of it, although I'm not actually there right now. Tonight's talk is just one of many programs we offer, and as it says in our name, Wagner Free Institute, our programs are all free to make them truly accessible to everyone. We have a National Historic Landmark building that houses a museum, a library, and a historic lecture hall, which is where many of our programs take place. We offer a wide range of free courses and talks for adults, field trips, and lessons for children, and also have ongoing relationships with multiple Philadelphia public schools where we teach hands-on science. And now I'm happy to welcome Dr. Stanley Walling. He is an associate professor of anthropology at the Community College of Philadelphia and also a research fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the associate director of the program for Belize Archaeology Project, a regional research project in northwestern Belize, and he is the director of the Rio Bravo Archaeological Survey. He has focused much of his research on the lives of Maya commoners, including their environmental adaptations, agriculture, socio-political structure, economic organization, ritual, and mythology. His work has contributed very significantly to a growing understanding that were previously thought to be simple farmers in Maya culture were in fact active participants in pre-Hispanic Maya civilization with their own sets of priorities and their own distinctive and very sophisticated lifestyle and adaptations. And last, quickly, as I said, a plug for the Wagner. This program, like everything the Wagner offers, is free of charge. It's the Wagner's rather remarkable mission to make science widely accessible by being free. And that's something we've been doing for 166 years now. We've adapted to make our programs available online, and we will keep some programs online as we move forward. It's challenging to support all that we do and remain free. So if you enjoyed tonight's program or have participated in others and like those too, and would like to see more like it, please consider making a donation, or even better, becoming a member, which gives you benefits while you also support what we do. And to everyone who has contributed, we thank you. What we do is not possible without the support of our donors and members, and we're very grateful. So now I'm happy to turn the program over to Stan.
Well, thank you, Susan. Also, thank you, Joanna, for being an able and ready assistant. Welcome, everybody, to this talk. I'm very happy to be here. I strongly support the idea behind the Wagner Free Institute. I think it's an important institution. For those of you who are coming in for the first time who haven't been to the Wagner, I can say, based on my own personal experience, that it's a wonderful place to visit. So I'd strongly encourage you to do so. So I'm going to be talking tonight about my area of research, which is the ancient Maya. I'm going to go through several different pieces of information. I'm going to start by talking about Maya culture in general, very briefly. I'm also very aware that this is a mixed audience. And so I may be saying some things for people who are familiar with Maya culture or archaeology or ancient Latin America that is not new information. And others, I suspect, know very little about this. And particularly for the question and answer period at the end, I'm happy to bring people up to speed to whatever degree I can on whatever subjects here interest you. Now, I'm talking about sustainability today, and I should tell you that I'm going to go from talking about Maya culture to how we study Maya culture to give you an idea of the process we go through. I think it's very important for people to understand how information is developed if you're going to understand the conclusions that we come to, our interpretations. Subsequent to that, I'm going to talk about the Maya environment. The traditional environment, I'll say a little bit about what's happening today, particularly toward the end of the talk. I'm also then going to focus on how the Maya managed this environment. How did they survive? Population of millions of people in what is today considered a very challenging subtropical forest environment. Then I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about my own research at a particular site. I'm going to refer to it quite a bit in the course of the talk. My particular interest, as Susan has mentioned, is the lives of everyday people. And particularly for the Maya, that means people like simple craftsmen, it means farmers. And my research has focused largely on figuring out how sophisticated the lives of these people were. And it's been surprising to me what I've discovered over the years and how remarkably complex the lives that they lived were some many centuries ago. And then at the end, I'm going to have a few thoughts about what the Maya mean to us today, particularly in terms of the issue of sustainability. So I'll come back to that subject at the end. But what I'd like to do now is share my screen. Okay, so we're going to come back to this image in a little while. So if you have any questions about it, realize that I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to be talking about it in a few minutes. When we think of Maya culture, we typically think of a number of things. This is the home area of Maya culture. It consists of southeastern Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and what you can't see here, the western ends of El Salvador and Honduras. This is an area roughly the size of probably New England. I'm sort of guessing at that. I probably should have checked the square kilometers or miles, but it's not a huge area, but it's not small either. And what you're looking at is a satellite view, and you can see that in the satellite, it's still covered by greenery, much of it thick tropical forest, though that is being deforested at an incredibly rapid rate. Now, here is a map of the peninsula, and what you're looking at is those little triangles are major Maya sites. That darkened area in the center of the peninsula is called either the elevated interior region, it's sometimes called the Petén Plateau. This is an area that is higher than the rest of the lowlands. Now, what are the lowlands? The lowlands consist of roughly all of Belize, the northern half of Guatemala, and the part of Mexico, much of the part of Mexico that you can see. The area to the south of that is the Maya Highlands, and this is a volcanic area with many peaks, many active volcanoes today. The ancient Maya occupied both regions, but the heartland of ancient Maya culture was the Petén Plateau, that darkened area you see there. Now, the geology here is what's called karstic. In other words, it is limestone based. The peninsula, for the most part, is a flat shelf of limestone that rose out of the sea quite a few million years ago. The deposits themselves are Eocene and Oligocene. That's not important. Just realize that we're talking about tens of millions of years ago. And so today what we have is a limestone peninsula with all the characteristics of a limestone environment. That means that water drains through the surface very easily. There are very few rivers on this peninsula, and the ones that exist are at the peripheries, at the edges of the peninsula, and they're not terribly large as rivers go for the areas they drain. Much of the water on the peninsula flows underground through solution holes, through caves, and that means that for people to access them, they have to have a way to get underground, and they do so through things. Well, they do so through caves. They do so through things called Chiltoones. They do so by means of things called cenotes, which I'm going to talk about when I get into the environment a little bit more. So when we are thinking about Maya culture, we often think of things like this. This is a restored ancient temple. It was built at the height of the classic period. Maya culture traces its roots to perhaps 900 BC in this area. That time, that period was called the pre-classic, which goes up to about 150 AD. From 150 AD to 900 AD was the apogee of Maya culture in terms of population size, in terms of architectural and artistic achievements. The period subsequent to that is the post-classic, and that terminates with the arrival of the Spaniards in the early 1500s. So what you're looking at is a solid masonry base with a temple on top. This is very different from Western concepts of architecture, which tend to emphasize interior space. In Maya culture, much of what occurs in our culture inside occurred outside. And most of these buildings that you see, whether they're small or large, are built around plazas or patios, all the way from small households up to the centers of magnificent cities like this particular city, Tikal. So when we're doing archaeology, what is it we find? We don't find them looking like this. Here you see a temple that is unrestored, and a couple of my staff members are climbing up what used to be a stairway. Actually, if you dig down 2 or 3 feet, you would probably find the stairway somewhat intact. So if we go back and look at this stairway that you see here is almost certainly what is below the feet of the members of my project as they climb up it. This is what we find. As a matter of fact, this is partially cleared. Typically, these are covered by thick trees, tremendously thick growth. We also think of the writing system. We're looking here at hieroglyphs from the site of Palenque. These were carved in stucco, but many of them, most of the ones we find, were carved in limestone. It's a complex writing system. We also think of things like this. This is a Maya stela or monument. So if you go to a tourist agency and you look at the posters for Mexico, Guatemala, and other places in Central America, this image is one of the poster childs for Maya culture. You'll see this reproduced quite a bit. This is from one of the stelas dedicated to a ruler named 18 Rabbit, who lived in the 8th century at the site of Copan. And these monuments were billboards. They recorded history, but they also are really emblematic of the egos and the political play that's going on in these cities. The Maya world consisted of semi-independent city-states that had alliances with one another. And they were constantly jousting, juggling their power relations with the shifting alliances, dynastic marriages, and other things. So that's what a stela looks like when it's been re-erected, when it's been cleaned and conserved. This is the way we find them. This is a stela of actually about the same size. And here it is with a tree growing out of it. Often we find these stelas covered in earth, entirely buried. They are, though, one of the things we think of when we think of this interesting culture. The point I'll make is that everything you're looking at was built without the use of pack animals, and it was built without the use of metal. The primary tool available to the Maya, other than wood and bone, was what you're looking at here, chert, which some people also call flint. So it was tools like this that built these magnificent temples, some of which are over 20 stories tall, and palaces that had 100 or more rooms in them. So what I'm interested in, though, is what you're looking at here. This is an image, it's a model, but it is a reconstruction of 2 Maya houses around a small patio during the late Classic period. These are the people I really want to know about. These were 95% or more of ancient Maya culture. So I have a ground up view of Maya society, and it runs counter to that of a lot of my professors who are very much top down. So what do we find today in the forests? Well, this is an ancient house mound. It's just it looks like a pile of rubble, but what it is several levels of occupation. The Maya tended to rebuild their platforms, which are made of stone and earth, the surfaces that were covered with plaster, and then had a perishable building built on top of them. That was a typical house structure. And we find buildings like this. This structure is about 2 meters tall. This is the tallest building, the largest house mound at the site where I'm working today. So out of 350 structures, this is the largest. Some structures are so small, you can't see them on the surface. You'll only find them if you do test pitting or if you clear all surface growth and look for little traces, linear stone features that represent ancient walls. So how do we go about investigating all of this? Well, in archaeology, we have a number of tools available to us and a number of standard procedures. So one is excavation. Here you're looking at a trench in the playing alley of the ball court at the site at which I've talked about. That site's name is Chawak Butaab in Maya. I often just call it Chawak, or I use the site's reference number, which is RB47. And if anybody's interested at the end, I can talk about the numbering system we use. What you see here is a ball court. And I'll talk more about what a ball court is as we move on in the talk. Two of my staff members are here in the pit. There's a student assisting here, and they've dug across much of the playing alley and they've exposed a standing wall. In many cases, we find buildings that just look like piles of rubble. When we clear them, we begin to see intact architecture. Now, what else do we do in archaeology? Well, we dig stratigraphically, layer by layer, and we do so with great care, using trowels, in some cases dental picks, but also things like ceramic tools, little wooden or plastic ceramic tools, and we photograph and record every layer. And typically in the Maya area, deposits are no more than about a meter deep. There are exceptions to that, but most of the households that we're investigating were relatively shallow. So here a student is carefully cleaning the surface. This excavation has just begun, and we go down in particular layers, no more than 10 centimeters in depth. And then we record everything through notes, but also through photography. We're taking measurements. We're always recording things. When people think of archaeology, they think of people with pickaxes and shovels. In some places in the world, they're used, but we hardly ever use them in the Maya area. Most digging is done very carefully and slowly, and most of the time is spent not excavating, but recording what you've exposed. So note taking is vital, a vital part of the process. Here you see a student clearing down a shallow excavation, a shallow trench. He's clearing off bedrock and an exposed stone in preparation for photography. We also excavate in caves. In my particular site, there are several caves, and they have been very thoroughly excavated. This is another type of archaeology that has its own character and its own specialists who work in this area. You can see on the left a specialist I invited in, Crystal Kiefer, at the time was at the University of New Mexico, and she trained a number of my students, but she is a continuing member now of my project because of all the underground features that we're finding. Once you've excavated soil, you screen it. You run it through a screen of typically quarter inch mesh. And here you see a student sifting through the soil, pulling out artifacts. And they consist of pottery and stone tools for the most part, where we are working. Those tools and ceramic pieces are taken to a laboratory, and this is our field lab near the excavation area. And a student is working here on cleaning, consolidating, and reconstructing a pot that was found at a site adjacent to mine. And another part of the process is recording things on the ground, recording the topography, recording where buildings are, recording where we find features like waterways. So to do that, we use a mapping station. A mapping station is an electronic device. It's based on the use of an infrared laser, highly accurate. You see the same sort of thing being used all the time on roadway construction. So you've probably seen things that may be identical to this particular mapping station. And the way it works is an infrared laser is shot out, it hits a prism, a mirror, the type you're seeing being held on by the person on the right. That infrared laser bounces back to the machine and it calculates the time and the distance to about 5 millimeters, about half a centimeter. It's a highly, highly accurate tool. It's the best mapping tool we've come up with. Now, we can send a student some distance, and we can shoot points as much as 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers away with this device. But the reality is, in a forest environment like this, we only go maybe 50 meters or 75 meters at a time. And at the end of the day, here you see my survey director processing mapping data in the lab in camp. And I talked about note taking. When you're in the field, particularly if you're working in the tropics and you're working at a distance, it's very expensive. You have to make the most of not only every day, but every hour. So most of the people in my project are in the field all day. And then at night, after typically after having dinner, they spend a couple of hours working on their notes. If you excavate something, if you record something, if you map something, but you don't record it, which means you can't share that information with others, then your work is basically useless. Now, the product of survey is what you see here. This is a map of one of the sites at which I'm working, this site, Chowok, which has gotten a lot of attention from me over several years. We're going to come back to this map a little bit later. So keep it in mind. Something else we encounter that, frankly, I think a lot of people miss in my area are ground level structures that today are covered with a thin level of soil. These were houses built often on ground level. They were perishable except for stones that we find today that outlined the exterior walls and interior walls of these buildings. These are ancient Maya houses. These are some of the things I'm very interested in, but these are some of the things that have been missed over the years by a number of my colleagues. Archaeology in the Maya area started with attention being paid to palaces, to hieroglyph covered monuments, to temples. And people have moved out from that. And I'm one of the people who's looking for the most obscure of remains to try to fill in the blank spots in our understanding of Maya culture. Something else that we use is Lidar. Now, I should have said something right off the bat. I should talk about the people who are funding my research. I need to credit the National Science Foundation, National Geographic Society, Google Corporation, and Montclair State University in New Jersey, and where I am now, the Community College of Philadelphia. So these are the people who are helping pay for what you're looking at here. It's, as I said, it's extremely expensive to run a project like this. So what does Lidar give us? This is a Lidar map of an ancient Maya city, not too far from where I am. What you're looking at are two large plazas, one in the north, one in the south, and then it's surrounded by smaller structures. And if we had the capability of doing so here, I can't do it in a PowerPoint, but I could zero in on things here. I could expand the scale and zero in on something as small as probably 2 meters in length. So it's a great tool for identifying even obscure remains. Lidar works by sending out laser pulses, usually from an airplane, though it doesn't have to be. Increasingly, Lidar is being used with drones, but whatever the tool that you're using to get Lidar images, these laser pulses, thousands of them a minute, are sent out from the source. They bounce back, they're picked up by a receiver, and then they are processed to create the image that you see. This city is covered with forest. Lidar is the first tool we've developed that allows us to look below the forest cover. So in Southeast Asia and Africa and in Latin America in particular, forest cover has been a real impediment to understanding settlement patterns, either locally or regionally. So this tool, this relatively new tool, is a godsend, and it's changing the way we do archaeology. Here's another image, and this happens to be what you looked at before, the map of Chowok Butob, and that site extends for, if you can see my cursor, all the way from here. Well, let me go back. From here down to about here. That's about 1 kilometer in length. And we'll come back to that. And another tool we use is ground penetrating radar. This allows us to look inside structures and identify the number of levels of construction that are there, features like voids, which might be tombs. It's a very useful tool, and it's something I've been using for quite a few years. It gives me a heads up as to where I might want to excavate and where I might not want to excavate. This is also something of great value, and this is relatively new. These are a couple of researchers from Google who are working with me right now. This is cloud scanning, and cloud scanning is an extremely accurate laser-based system that measures distances that we can use for mapping purposes, but it also creates images similar to the one I'm going to show you in a moment that can measure. We can get a measurement on the thickness of a piece of bark on a tree. It's really a remarkable tool, but it requires specialists to operate and to process the data. Now, this is not a cloud scanning image, but cloud scanning images can look very much like this. What you're looking at in the center of this image are two parallel buildings. That's a ball court. And this, however, was done by photogrammetry. So photogrammetry is a tool that's somewhere between using a mapping station and using cloud scanning. This is actually very easy to do. What you need is a 35mm camera. You take multiple shots of a feature, such as a structure, piece of architecture, in 3 dimensions. And then with the software that's available now, you can stitch those images together to create a 3-dimensional view. And we can then, using the software, rotate the objects. We can record them with very good accuracy, though not as great as cloud scanning. This is an intermediate step between total mapping station work and cloud scanning. It's actually relatively cheap in comparison to both of those. That makes it very valuable as a recording tool. Now, I'm going to be talking about a ball court later, and I thought I would just stop and talk about what a ball court is and why it's significant. This is a ball court, a restored ball court at the site of Copan, a major Maya city in Honduras. You're looking at 2 parallel buildings that have a playing alley between them and end zones on opposite ends of that playing alley. A game sort of like soccer was played here with a hard rubber ball. You couldn't pick the ball up with your hands. Players bounce the ball largely off probably their knees, their hips, maybe their shoulders. And we think, and there may have been different versions of this game, but we think they scored for the most part by getting the ball in the end zone. In some of these, you see stone rings, and getting the ball through a ring was like getting a hole-in-one in golf. It was pretty significant. We know about this game because the Spaniards saw it being played when they arrived in the 1500s. So we have some reasonable accounts. In Maya studies, people were perplexed in the 1800s when they first encountered some of the Maya cities. And at the center, they found these ball courts, relatively diminutive in comparison to, let's say, the palace structures or a 20-story temple pyramid that were arrayed around them. We at first thought that the Maya must have been sports fanatics, but now we know that the ball game that was played here was something of great religious significance. Every time a game was played, it recreated the day of creation in 3114 BC in the Maya calendar, in which hero twins defeated the gods of death and fostered the creation, the current creation, including humanity. So kings were crowned in ball courts, not in palaces, not in temples. They often dressed as ball game players, even if they were not playing the game themselves. So what you're looking at is something that is central to Maya thinking, central to the way they organized their living space and their formal ritual space and even political and economic space. Now, Ball courts for a long time were only found in cities. And a few years ago, I encountered this. This is a ball court. You're looking directly up the playing alley. You can see the scale of it. One of my staff members is standing off to the right. It's about 2 meters tall. The buildings are about 2 meters high, and they have a playing alley in between them. This was found in a farming community, a community that did not have sophisticated architecture, didn't have hieroglyphic writing, didn't create murals. We have no evidence that there's anything we would think of as elite culture being at this site other than the ball court. It's not at the center of a city. As a matter of fact, it's not even at the center of the farming community. It was way off to the southern end of it. And I've been working at trying to explain this for years. And I have a number of ideas that some of which I'll talk about today, but not in great detail. Here's another view of that. So what we're looking at here is an example of what the Maya uplands, the thick tropical forest that we encounter, the traditional environment that we encounter today in areas that are still forested. You can see a thatched Maya house, and around it are an array of small plants. I don't have another view of this, but almost certainly they're part of what we call a kitchen garden or a household garden. And what do we find in these forests, though, in areas that have not been turned into living area? We find a lot of trees like this. This is a tree with buttressed roots. If you've been in the tropics, you've probably seen some fairly large ones. In the Maya area, they get up to about 200 feet tall at the tallest. In most places, they're between about 125 and 150 feet in height. And just to give you a sense of the scale of these, this is a group of mine standing around the base of that tree. That gives you some sense of how large these roots are and how large these trees are. In areas where there is still old growth, you find large numbers of these truly massive trees, but there are fewer and fewer places in the Maya area where you can find them because they're being cut at an alarming rate. Deforestation is a major, major problem in the Maya area and in other parts of the world too. So I'll get back to that. I'll get back to that. But in terms of the way the Maya used landscape, there's probably a lot of variation between communities, but a study that was done recently of one of the major Maya cities found that about 40% of the sustaining area, supporting area, economic supporting area for this particular city was left in old growth forest. And that probably served as a hunting area. It probably supplied a variety of medicines, foods. As a matter of fact, the modern Maya today make use of the vast, vast majority of plants and trees that are in these forests. So if the ancient Maya did what the modern Maya do, then these forests were sort of like supermarkets to them. And they maintained them very intentionally. They maintained these old growth trees. Another 40% of the area within an ancient Maya city, or this particular one that I'm talking about, consisted of upland agriculture, and that's slash and burn or swidden farming. And I'll show some images of that in a little while. And part of that 40%, though, if there were wetlands, some percentage of the farming was actually done in a wetland environment. I'll talk more about that when I actually get to how the Maya managed their environment. This is another part of the Maya environment. This is a cenote. This is a place where water has eroded the limestone, and you can see the stratified limestone that's in place here, and that has been eaten away, and part of it has at least collapsed into this deep cenote, and they're usually circular and or something very close to it. even in the seasonal dry periods, and rains were seasonal in the Maya area, they could typically access water through these cenotes. Now, what was that seasonality? In the Maya area today, the rainy season, the wet season, typically runs from around June or July to November to December. And the high point is August, September, and October. And before paved roads were as common as they are today in the Maya area, and they're not everywhere, but they're much more common than they used to be. When the rains came, the roads turned to mud. And I know this from personal experience, you could be stuck in an area without access to transportation for weeks at a time while you were waiting for the roads to get dry enough so you can get a vehicle across them. This is something else that we see. This is a Chiltoon. A Chiltoon is an underground chamber in which the Maya stored food and water. And probably most of them stored water because you needed to store water during the rainy season. A lot of households had these built into the patios that were located next to their homes. They collected water during the rainy season. Then at the end of the rainy season, they capped it and opened it up to get household water for drinking, for cleaning, and cooking, and other purposes. What you're looking at here is an image of Chiltoons, a cross-section, an idealized cross-section from the 1840s, from one of the first people to explore the Maya area. These Chiltoons, you can see, are at the bottom of what looks like a lake. It's actually what we call an aguada. There are depressions in the Maya area that collect water during the rainy season. Some are natural, some are artificial, some were created by the ancient Maya, but either through natural processes or artificial ones, there's very often a layer of clay at the bottom of these aguadas that keeps the water from draining away. In this case, what you see is what locals had done. This was in an area of Yucatan that's pictured here, but it was done more widely. Chiltoons were dug during the dry season in dry aguadas. They were left open. When the rains came and an aguada filled with water, the Chiltoons also filled with water. When the aguada dried out, the Chiltoons were capped, and then the water was used to get people through the dry season, which is a major challenge. The rainy season is very wet, and the dry season is very dry in the Maya area. So they had aguadas. They had cenotes in some places. Cenotes are natural. They are not created by the Maya. So they often built communities around cenotes, but cenotes didn't occur across the entire Maya region. You couldn't count on one being in an area if you, let's say you decide you want to live in a particular part of the Maya zone. If you were lucky, that was the case. Here we see an ancient Maya city, and what you're looking at are reservoirs. These, if you can see my cursor, the area here and here and here, these were quarries that were used to get the stone used in building homes and building temples and palaces. And then they were used, these open pits were used as reservoirs. And if we look at the next image, this is a plan view of that same location. You can see a reservoir here, a reservoir here. There's actually a huge dam that was used to create this reservoir. This is the largest dam known in the Maya area. This one's about 240 feet long, and it's about 10 meters high, probably about 30 to 35 feet. So you see reservoirs, but you also see this little, relatively little, at least on this map, feature. This is a silting tank. It's where water runoff would go and then it would be held and the silt would drop out of it. These things are also called catchment basins. And I'll talk more about that as we move on. So these are the tools that the Maya had some of the tools the Maya had to manage their environment. I talked about catchment basins a few minutes ago. This is one of my field director, pointing to something in the wall of this excavation. Do you see these large rocks? This is a water basin that was filled with rocks, and it functioned as a catchment basin. In other words, during the rainy season, water would flow in here. These rocks would slow the movement of the water. Soil would drop out of it, and then the water would continue over a series of terraces that also slowed the movement of water, meaning it slowed erosion. It reduced the amount of soil that was being carried away. And in the dry season, these could be dug out. The soil that was collected could be put back in agricultural fields. This is something else the Maya created. They dug canals, particularly in agricultural areas. And these canals were used for transportation. They were also used for food. Fish and crustaceans were farmed in these particular areas. And at the site where I'm working now, I think I've discovered fish weirs, stone fish weirs that were used to contain the fish that were growing and living in these canals. I suspect in my area it was a major source of food. Something else, this is an aqueduct in a Maya city. This was completely covered with a stone vault. A lot of water during the rainy season coursed through it. It had stone walls, it minimized erosion, and it sent water into reservoirs. Maya sites have a lot of water management features. I'll talk more about several of them. These are terraces, stone-fronted terraces. Among other things, they function sort of like a catchment basin. They will slow the movement of water, and once that water is slowed, any soil it's carrying will be dropped, and it's being dropped in an area that was typically used for agriculture, though not in all cases. Some terraces were used as living space. Now, what does a terrace look like when we find it? Well, this shows you a terrace surface. There's a stone wall in here that's partially collapsed, but it's covered by a foot or two of soil. And when you're walking through the forest, you don't know always whether you are walking on something that's artificial or natural. I've stood on top of pretty sizable mounds in the Maya area with colleagues who are experts at Maya studies. And we have had pretty lengthy discussions about whether we're standing on something that's artificial or natural. For the most part, you only know when you carry out an excavation or you use something like ground penetrating radar, which might show, let's say, a zigzag pattern typical of a stairway. This is another tool the Maya used. This checkerboard pattern you see, they're raised fields. Raised fields were soil islands that were created by the Maya, usually within bodies of water like marshes or very close to them where water could be circulated through them. They're very highly productive. I did quite a bit of research on these years ago when I was doing my dissertation. And the evidence seems to be that each plot of land here is probably about 5 to 10 times as productive as an equivalent piece of dry land. Now, that includes the ability to plant year-round. In the seasonal pattern we see today in much of Latin America, there's usually one reasonable growing season. When you have something that's surrounded by water, by canals, all year long, you can grow continuously. And the nutrients from the canals in ancient times were typically scooped up and put on top of the fields. So there was constant replenishment of nutrients and constant availability of water, meaning that the productivity of these features, which we are finding now in great numbers, was really quite substantial. Years ago, I did an estimate of just a small area, very small area of the Maya lowlands and the raised fields that we were finding there. And my calculation was that this small area supported 250,000 people, which means that the food was probably produced in these highly intensive agricultural zones and then exported. There's quite an argument in my field now about whether that actually took place, but I see no other way of understanding the productivity level that we see in these features. Something else the Maya did was manage their soil fairly effectively. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but soil is a study unto itself. Here you see one of my students carrying out a soil study. She's collecting soil using these PVC stakes. What the Maya did with their soil is, well, they planted it. During using swidden, they let it lie fallow. But one of the things we realize now is that probably soot from fires was incorporated into the soil, either intentionally or unintentionally, as well as charcoal. We know in other places this has been done intentionally, and it increases the fertility of the soil and the longevity of it. Something else the Maya did, in and around their residences, they typically planted medicinal and economic plants. What you see here is a model of a house that was covered by volcanic ash around 530 AD. And this one site, Soaring in El Salvador, has given us a lot of information about what was going on at the household level because of the preservation that's there. Preservation we don't normally find. So you see here some structures. This is probably an extended family living in 1, 2, 3, 4 structures. This feature here is not a residential structure, but these trees and probably things that did not survive the volcanic eruption, like small medicinal plants, they were grown in and around houses. So I said that maybe 40% of the area was devoted to agriculture. That sort of includes these residential zones. Here you see an example of slash and burn agriculture, also called swidden. It's being carried out by a Maya family, and the ash that is generated by this, typically large trees are left in place and all the small growth is cut and burned. And this, the ash is then incorporated into the soil. It aids fertility, but this pattern has its problems. You might have to, if you grow for 3 seasons in a plot like this, you might have to let it lie fallow, unused, regenerating its fertility for 7, 8, or maybe 10 seasons. So in terms of its economic productivity, it's not terribly high. But as long as you let land lie fallow, it doesn't create too much damage. However, when cultures are under stress, they tend to short fallow. And instead of letting land lie fallow for, let's say, 8 years or 10 years, they will start reducing it to 6, then 5, then 4. What does that do? Over time, it exhausts the fertility of the soil. And this is one of the things that happened toward the end of Maya culture. Okay, so here's the map of the site that I showed you before. This is what that map looks like when I map out the water drainage patterns. At the site, the site is about 1 kilometer long and 0.5 kilometer wide. But in that area, that 0.5 square kilometer, there's 4 or more linear kilometers of terracing. And there are at least 4.5 linear linear drainage lines running through the site. Now, these sites were not just natural drainage areas. Very often the water was redirected. In some cases, it was actually reversed. These drainage lines were filled with terraces and check dams and direction devices that heavily determined the rate and the area in which water was flowing. For a farming community, what we're talking about is a major piece of architectural engineering. This was done according to local standards. Kings and nobles didn't come into this site and say, this is what we want you to do. These people were making their own decisions. And they did that in a lot of ways. And there are a variety of lines of evidence for that. So I won't go into that, but it's one of the exciting things about the research at this particular site. I'm going to focus here on one area, the ball court at the site, which is in the far southern end. And remember, nobody's seen a ball court in the Maya area at a site like this. Do I think the site is unique? No. It's just that most people have not looked carefully at really peripheral, small areas of architecture in the Maya area. And some of the people I'm training are doing that now themselves. And I'd like to think I'm contributing to research that's going to go on for many years to help understand this level of Maya architecture, but also the people who occupied and lived in these areas. Anyway, here you have the two parallel ball court buildings. Water drained out of the ball court itself. There's a ridge here. If you can read topo lines, you know that this area is much higher than this area here where the ball court is. So water drained down from these hills into this area. And this is something that really caught me by surprise. It hasn't been seen in the Maya area before. And that is that the water, natural flow of water is where my cursor is going right now. But what happened was the Maya built a series of water basins, connected water basins. And also the first time this was seen in the Maya area. I'm still trying to figure out why they were connected and what they did, but it caused the flow of water to be reversed, which is really pretty remarkable. And they did this for practical reasons, but also for ritual reasons. So I won't go into that right now, but suffice it to say that this particular ball court reproduces, because of the way it manages water, or the ancient builders managed water, it reproduces two distinct stories of creation, which were important to the Maya. So let's move on. And remember, I talked about those connected water basins. What you're looking at here are these water basins. One of my field directors here has her foot on a stone wall that you can't see, but there's another one here, another one here, another one here, another one here, extending downhill. And these are all silted up. When I first walked over this area, I didn't even see them. It wasn't until I began clearing the surface, which is very laborious, that I realized that there was something interesting going on here. So this is just one area of investigation. This site is filled with things. Every time I go into the field, I find something new that I didn't expect. So what happened to the Maya? You know, with all this management of water, of soil, why did Maya culture collapse? Well, a couple of things were going on. Maya population was expanding during the Classic period. And probably by about 700 AD, it reached a real high point. The estimates for the number of people in the lowlands, in the Maya lowlands, are in some cases several tens of millions by about 800 AD. I think 30 million is about the largest estimate I've seen. I have some reason to believe that some of the estimates that are out there might actually be low. But they managed the forests, they managed the soil. They did a very good job from the pre-classic period, probably from about 500 or 600 BC until around 700 AD. So over 1,000 years of careful management. But several things happened. One is that they did not control their population levels. And toward the end, the population expanded rapidly, very rapidly. And it also was a period of time probably when authority was increasingly centralized. I haven't talked about the politics, but there's fairly good lines of evidence for that. These autocrats who were ruling these sites, they probably were autocrats or something close to that, had large-scale building programs for a variety of things, everything from defensive walls to massive temples and palace complexes. And for the first time, they began to cut down these old growth forests that they had maintained for 1,000 years or more. So they started deforestation. Already, 60% or so of that forest was already gone, but they had maintained that 40%. And this probably was a tipping point. Environmental students of environmental change have pointed out that when you remove forest, you can change water patterns, rain patterns. And a number of my colleagues who deal with climate issues think that this process probably changed the climate starting in the late classic period. At the same time, they were short fallowing their fields, soil was becoming exhausted, and more soil was being washed away. We know this because we're finding from the late classic period increasing amounts of soil accumulating in the bottom of aguadas that comes from elevated farming areas. So they're losing topsoil. The soil that's staying was losing its fertility. The climate was changing. And I personally expect that under these circumstances, the Maya were pretty good about regulating things. I think they could have worked their way through this. But what they couldn't anticipate and what they couldn't deal with was drought. Now, there's a lot of argument in my field about this, but some of the recent evidence is very strong that there was an extended drought starting perhaps in the late 8th century and maybe extending all the way to the beginning of the 10th century. But it probably had its peak between about AD 820 and 870. And that's when the vast majority of Maya sites are abandoned, when the population goes into extreme, severe decline. Probably what happened is in that period of time, as water availability becomes a real problem, I don't imagine people just up and died or even up and left. Probably over several generations, people's health declined, people reproduced less effectively, and from a historical perspective, you would say that the civilization declined rapidly. As they saw it, it probably took 2 or 3 generations. Nevertheless, there probably were people who in 870 AD could remember what things were like in 800 AD. There were a few of them at least. And they knew that things had changed rapidly. The last inscriptions in Maya sites occurred toward the end of the 9th century and the beginning of the 10th. Last recorded dates in Maya inscriptions are 909 AD at several sites. And that appears to be the true end of the classic period. So I think that the drought that I'm talking about had a major effect on Maya culture. I think it spelled the end of classic Maya culture. Maya farmers and other people survived in small numbers around some of these cities, but the central cities were abandoned. People no longer had kings, queens, nobility, and a formal priesthood. That disappeared in almost all Maya sites. What caused that ultimately, I think, is this drought. A number of my colleagues talk about evidence for warfare, competition of a variety of types. My view, based on the evidence I've seen, is those things are byproducts of the collapse of culture, not the cause of the collapse. So if we look at the Maya, based on all the things I've talked about, it's clear that they were very good about managing their environment. They managed to survive in a challenging environment with soils that have tended to be sort of thin and fragile, where there are extremes of rain and dryness, deep tropical forest growth. They survived in that environment and thrived for over 1,000 years before they went into decline. Do we learn anything, or can we learn anything from the Maya? Well, I think so. We're living in a world today that is a lot like what was going on in the Maya area during the late Classic. So today we have over-farming of soils. We have soil exhaustion. We have massive deforestation. Here's an image of forest removal, recent image of forest removal from Guatemala. I see the same sort of thing where I'm working in Belize. Probably this is one plot of land that's owned by one person. The forest to the right is owned by another, and the owner of the land on the left cut things right up to the property line. And so this sort of landscape that you see on the left is normally tree covered, but this is happening on a large scale. It's happening in South America, it's happening in Central America, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia. So we're seeing deforestation, soil loss. We're seeing a rapid increase in population around the world. We're seeing, I think, increasing concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of relatively few people. And I suspect that with deforestation, we're also going to experience even more climate extremes than we've experienced recently. So the Maya are a warning to us. I hope we heed that warning. I know some people are paying careful attention to the environment. Unfortunately, I'd say particularly in Western culture, in the high-tech industrialized world, there isn't right now sufficient focus on these problems to remedy them easily. I'm hopeful for the future, but when I look at the Maya as a model, I sometimes feel that we may be following in their footsteps. Anyway, thanks very much. I hope that this has been interesting. I'm going to stop my share right now, and I would be happy to address any questions. So I don't know, Susan, if you want to relay any questions to me, or want me to handle them directly?
So the first one is a climate change question. Given that climate change is making the entire Caribbean region drier, does this imply that all islands and regions in the Caribbean should take a lesson from the Maya and develop rainwater storage facilities in underground limestone caves?
I think anyone who wants to develop water storage is, I don't think there's any problem in doing that. What we're seeing are radical changes across the planet. Some places that were relatively dry are becoming very wet. Some places that were very wet are now becoming relatively dry. As far as the Caribbean goes, this is also true of the Maya area. Where I'm working, the dry season is becoming increasingly dry, and it's actually lasting longer than normal. So much so that animals and plants are suffering tremendously. So I don't think water storage in any area is inappropriate. Depending on particular circumstances, if you have a community that's next to a perennial river, they may not want to do that. But there are areas that are suffering environmentally. Haiti, for example, is in the environment there is in horrible shape. So I think that would be a reasonable thing to do.
To what extent are some of the known Maya practices for water, forest, and soil management and agriculture evident today?
Well, when classic culture collapsed around AD 900, and some remnants of classic culture survived probably until 1000 AD in the far north of Yucatan. When that happened, Maya culture was sort of decapitated, at least to some degree. And certainly whatever was left of centralized authority and elite control was fully done away with when the Spaniards arrived in the 1500s. So what's left to us today to observe is what has been called by sociologists and some anthropologists the folk level of culture, level of everyday people, farmers, simple craftsmen. They do not themselves practice everything the ancient Maya did. So for example, there are no Maya today who have maintained a tradition of using raised fields. Some people have encouraged them, some researchers have encouraged them to try to revive them with interesting effect, and that may go forward and that process may be expanded. But the raised fields at the end of the classic period were largely abandoned. Complex terracing, at least in the lowlands, was largely abandoned. There's still Maya today who make use of terraces that were built 1200 years ago, but these terraces are not as functional and as effective as they were then. For the most part, the terraces that survive today are heavily collapsed. So what does survive? Well, kitchen gardens survive. Swidden agriculture survives. But the complex water management and perhaps soil management does not. Something else the Maya did was really, I didn't use this term, but they managed forests, meaning that they probably made sure that any trees they harvested were being replaced by saplings or something similar. The Maya probably managed forests through the post-classic, but after the arrival of the Spaniards, forest management was done on a very limited basis. The last place I know in which the forest management occurred among the Maya in an effective way was among a group of people called the Lacandon. And they're some of the oldest members of the Lacandon group are familiar with forestry management, but that knowledge is being lost. Every time one of them dies, a certain body of information is disappearing. So Swidden agriculture, terracing, until recently, some forest management, those things survive. I would like to see more of an effort to revive ancient agricultural patterns and maybe water management. And perhaps this is going to be successful. Right now, what's going on in both, well, in the Maya area certainly is not as extensive as I would like to see it. I think raised field agriculture could be properly done, would be very effective. Would be very effective.
Another question different is early in the presentation, you noted the Maya achieved state level civilization without pack animals. Did they also not use domesticated animals for food? There's a couple of questions embedded, so let me give them all and you can tackle it. How could their population grow so large without reliable protein and fat sources? The Aztecs turned to eating people, humans, to solve this. Why is there such a big difference in their diets?
That's an interesting question. Thank you for that, whoever asked. There's some thought that the Maya might have domesticated deer. It's not clear that they did, but perhaps they did. And if so, that would have created a very reliable protein source. Also, they used fish fairly extensively where they had canals or were near water. They relied heavily on fish and the crustaceans, small crustaceans you find in these canals, in waterways all over. As far as the forest animals, they probably harvested everything that wasn't sacred. So the jaguar was sacred, monkey was sacred, but just about anything else would have been fair game. And I'm not an expert on animal use. Some of my colleagues focus heavily on that, but the literature indicates that there was a fairly diverse protein diet based on animals from the forests. If you're assuming that these old growth forests are surviving across the Maya lowlands in reasonable numbers, there are reasonable patches of these forests, then the protein supply until the late Classic period probably was fairly good. Now, the Aztecs turned to human sacrifice and cannibalism. The Maya, we know, carried out human sacrifice, but the evidence is it was much, much more limited than what you see in the Aztec area. So it's not an option. Large-scale consumption of human flesh was not an option the Maya took. We know in the late Classic, though, that skeletal material we are finding from the late Classic indicates that everyone from farmers all the way up to nobility had interrupted periods of growth. So that suggests malnutrition or no nutrition at all of any substance was a problem for people at all levels of Maya culture in the late Classic, probably by about 700 AD. So by about 700, I would expect that their food sources were becoming inadequate for the population size.
What tools did they use to cut the large trees?
Probably chert axes. They would have gotten dull quickly and needed to have been sharpened. One technique for cutting large trees is to build a fire, cut away the bark, and build a fire around the base of the trees and let the fire eat away at the substance of the tree until it can be felled very easily. The speculation that the Maya did this, I don't know that we have direct evidence of it, though, but it has been observed elsewhere as a way that large trees can be felled.
One person had asked earlier, and I missed it, what the beefy boots that people were wearing in the photos were. And I forget, like earlier in your presentation, and then somebody else commented that they were snake leggings.
Oh, those, yeah, they're snake guards, snake leggings. Because the area in which I'm working is previously unexplored. The animals there are abundant. They've never seen humans before. A lot of them don't know enough to get away from us. And even if they do, we can accidentally come across them. So far, I've been lucky. Nobody has been struck by a snake. My project, I make everybody wear these snake guards, though in other projects not too far away, a number of people have been bitten. So I take that very seriously. Yeah, they're snake leggings or snake guards. And everyone has to wear leather boots. So you're protected from your toes all the way up to your knees.
Someone asked, who did the building of all of the significant land structures? Was it all of the community in non-farming season? Or do you have any sense that there was a craft of stone masons?
Well, I suspect that at the elite level, there were specialized architects, there were specialized quarry people, there were specialized stone masons, There were people who did carvings in stone, and they had developed these skills, and these were probably passed down over many generations. When you see some of the things that were carved, you realize there was just remarkable levels of skill. And at the household level, at the level of Maya farmers, I suspect that a lot of what was done was work that was shared by a lot of people. And it's sort of assumed, and there's some evidence for this, that the dry season was a time when people were doing building, they were carrying out ritual activity. At the site where I'm working, I have reason to believe that there was a lot of cooperative labor between different groups, probably lineages. And I imagine just in moving earth that they used any able-bodied person who was willing to move land. What the gender differences were, we don't know. Based on the artistry, we know that there were different gender roles among the elites. How differentiated things were at the household level, it's hard to know. If you look at the modern Maya, most of the heavy labor is done by males. And women tend to manage things around households, but they don't, I can't think of a single example of women building houses. I could be wrong, but I can't think of a single example from the ethnographic literature. So I think there was a lot of cooperation at the lower level. A lot of people probably had a modicum of skills that were necessary, let's say, to quarry stone and to build relatively straightforward, simple architecture.
So there's two more questions, which is about what we have time for. So the first one is there any evidence of a population before the Maya? And this is part of the same question. And do we have evidence of any natural pesticides the Mayas used?
Well, let me answer the second question first. I know nothing of pesticides. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have them. I think a good way to investigate this, if someone wanted to, would be to look at the ethnographic literature and see what modern Maya are doing to keep bugs at bay. One thing I will say is when I go into the field with Maya workers, all the mosquitoes come to me. I don't know why. I don't know whether the Maya I'm working with have lathered something on themselves that I don't know about that keeps them at bay, but they seem to have a particular liking for me. The population, Maya population, seems to be pretty tolerant of insects. But that's a question that could be investigated by looking at the modern record. I don't think there's anything in the hieroglyphic record or the archaeological record that would provide any answer to that question. And the other question was, were there people there before the Maya? Well, around 900 BC in the Maya area, we see the first vestiges of farming villages. And rather rapidly, 3 to 4 centuries later, we have what may be state-level society. There are kings, there are monuments. The one thing that we don't see at that period of time is writing, which is what we usually think of as a marker of civilization. So it sort of looks like they were at the verge of being a state-level society or civilization by 500 or 600 BC. The lack of writing would cause some of my colleagues to say they weren't there yet. Now, before 900 BC, what do we know about? Well, it appears there were hunting and gathering groups. They were moving across the landscape. They were not building permanent settlements. I suspect that we will find evidence before 900 BC for village life, because it's certainly occurring elsewhere in Mesoamerica. But one of the problems in the Maya area is early deposits are deeply, deeply buried, for the most part, under soils, and there's little to no surface indication that something is there. So the people we generally recognize as Maya come into the picture around 900 BC. I would not be surprised, though, if we could discovered earlier skeletal material, that we would find that people who lived, say, a more nomadic lifestyle before that were the people who eventually learned to be sedentary and to maintain small farming hamlets and villages. So yes, there were people there before the Maya, to answer your question. And I think the Paleo-Indian period is the earliest known period. In the Maya area, I think the earliest date we have might be around 10,000 BC, something like that, I think. But I'm not sure. There's very, very little Paleo-Indian material. Interestingly, though, some of it comes from the area in which I'm working, although I haven't found anything that goes back that far.
Well, this will be the last question, and appropriately, it sort of swings back to the nature of your research, but it opens with a compliment. Great, informative, and thought-provoking presentation. So thank you for doing that. And the question is, are there trends among archaeologists in other regions, besides where you work, to focus more of their work on commoners as you are, rather than the elites?
Yeah. In the Maya area, the first people to focus on commoners, first person I can think of to focus on commoners, did so at about the beginning of the 20th century. And his work was largely ignored. A married couple, the Rickardsons, worked at a site called Chiltoon in the 20s, and they provided a lot of evidence of fairly extensive commoner habitation. Then there were periodically people through the 50s, 60s, 70s. It wasn't until probably the site of Copan, which I've mentioned, was investigated in the 70s that there became more of a systematic pattern. Now, in other places in the world, this is going on, but to greater and lesser degrees. I worked in Egypt for a while, and I tried to get permission to excavate what was probably an ancient farming village, for which I had very clear evidence. And I was told I wasn't going to find any statues or painted tombs, so nobody was going to give me a permit to do so. Quite frankly, in archaeology around the world, there's a really strong bias today toward elites, but there's growing awareness. When I go and talk to my colleagues at meetings, I encounter more and more grad students and young professionals who are really interested in the lives of daily people. If you're looking at archaeology on a global scale, one of the major gaps we have across the planet is figuring out the way everyday people lived at periods of time in the past. And there's, in different places to different degrees, there's a movement toward solving that problem.